Previously, I discussed how Immanuel Kant bridged the two philosophical approaches to epistemology, rationalism and empiricism. So in Western philosophy, Kant is like a funnel. He influenced another two branches of philosophy that came after him, which tried to answer some fundamental questions like what makes us who we are, what motivates our actions. Hegel's answer was history and rationality, while his arch-rival Schopenhauer's answer was the subconscious will. Hegel's philosophy went the sociological route, basing human action on history and rationality, while Schopenhauer's philosophy went the psychological route, basing human motivation on the subconscious blind will, or human passion. In this segment, I'll look at sociology and rationality by discussing philosophers including Hegel, Marx, Sartre, and Zizek, who argued that we are the product of history. But they didn't stop there. Since history makes us who we are, it's also our job to make history. So we're not only molded and shaped by the historical era in which we live in, but also through our own life choices. So social philosophy is built on the philosophy of progressive egalitarianism, stating that we are heading towards a perfectionist utopia on the one hand, and materialism, stating that the most important aspect of human life is the material success on the other. Of course, not all of them agreed on this. It's important to note that philosophers who came after Kant were in a sense responding to Kant, because his breakthrough in bringing the rationalists and empiricists together was a huge moment in philosophy. George Hegel, who lived between 1770 and 1831, too responded to Kant. Hegel had two problems with Kant. First, Kant argued that we humans only understand the phenomena, but we have no access to noumena, or the thing in itself. We can touch a rock, but we cannot fully understand it. For Hegel, this noumena world, which we can never fully know, looked like an empty abstraction, pure speculation based on Kant's own assumption. In other words, he just made it up by claiming that such a thing existed in the first place. Hegel's second problem with Kant was that he argued that our innate structure or categorization by which we interpret the world is fixed. In other words, we use a fish net or a framework by which we catch a fish or experience, but the net or the framework is always fixed and nobody can change it. For the history buff Hegel, everything, including human consciousness, was subject to change through time. History has shown us that humans evolve, so do our tools, including the fishnet or our ability to reason. In other words, everything has a history, even rock has a history, it changes through time. And humans are very much a product of a historical era. How do we change? Hegel says through dialectic processes. When two opposites collide, it makes a third thing that has a bit of both the original things, but it also has slightly different characters. Hegel says every phenomena or idea or thesis, as he called it, contains a contradiction within itself, which he called antithesis. And this conflict, which is resolved in synthesis, or a new idea which is an improvement or different from the thesis and antithesis. Like a child has a characteristic of both parents but also different from both. This historical process continues in generating new theses and antitheses which lead to further synthesis, and history continues. So according to Hegel, Kant was wrong in saying that human mental structure or reason does not change. For Hegel, everything is subject to change. It's important to note that Kant was a lot firmer in his religious belief than Hegel, which explains that Kant sees reason as a static while Hegel sees it as malleable and changeable through time. Another reason is, of course, the French Revolution, as well as the rise of Napoleon, which for the very first time in human history, ordinary people took power from the king and anyone could become Napoleon. So nothing was fixed. Kant, being a much older man, was furiously against any kind of revolution that could destabilize the status quo. For Hegel, the world has a history and we are for the most part the product of historical era. In other words, reality is a historical process, not constant. However, since we are the product of history, we can also affect the course of history through ideas that capture the spirit of an age. For example, Napoleon managed to influence history as he captured the spirit of 19th century Europe. People didn't believe in the absolute power of kings, so demanded change. Hegel can be characterized as a perfectionist rationalist, believing that history is moving towards perfection. Now, Hegel only interpreted history. His student wanted to change history. Karl Marx, who lived between 1818 and 1883, learned a great deal from Hegel. He came to the conclusion that if we are the product of history, our history must be the product of those who came before us. Marx had a problem. Hegel was good at interpreting history, even at recognizing the people who were capable of changing, but Marx was more concerned about changing things for the good, especially for the disadvantaged majority who were the real force behind economic production, i.e. the working class. Marx said the history of our existence has been nothing but a continuous class struggle between the haves and have-nots, the powerful and the powerless, with the powerful enjoying it all and the powerless having a tough time of it. So Marx developed a philosophy of rational materialism, arguing that material inequality was the root of all evils. He argued that humans are fundamentally motivated by material objects, so we are rational because we want material things. To solve this inequality, he adopted egalitarianism. For Marx, the perfectionist future utopia was an egalitarian society where you only worked for the hours that provided you enough subsistence, and the rest of the time you could relax on the beach. You can also see traces of Christianity in Marxism, the fight between good and evil, culminating in the weak overthrowing the powerful and turning the world into a utopian communist heaven, where everyone lives equally and happily ever after. But Marx was not religious, so he based his philosophy on rational materialism, in which all workers unite to overthrow the exploitative class and everyone lives in harmony and peace, and nobody starves. For Marx, not only communism was desirable, it was also historically inevitable because for him, history was moving towards perfection through incremental improvement or dialectical change, as Hegel said. For example, feudalism was an improvement on hunter-gatherer societies. Capitalism was an improvement on feudalism, socialism an improvement on capitalism, and finally communism an improvement on socialism. And for Marx, communism was the final phase of human history. You couldn't make it any better. Just like heaven, you cannot create a heaven that is better than another heaven. Or maybe you could, but generally heavens tend to mean perfection. If they do exist, of course. Marx's class-based analysis had deep communitarian roots or group-based. As a result, it failed in a highly individualized Europe, despite many attempts. For example, in the 1870s, Paris had a socialist revolution, but it didn't stick. Marxism found fertile soil in countries with strong communitarian bonds like Russia and China. So the 20th century witnessed many Marxist revolutions to move history in the right direction. These attempts had partial success but ultimately failed to create a communist utopia. So Hegel talked about history in motion, Marx talked about how to speed up that historical motion. Both Hegel and Marx saw things from a society's perspective. Now I'll discuss how this history-based philosophy applies to a person's own individual history from birth to death. If a society has a history, so does an individual. Jean-Paul Sartre, who lived between 1905 and 1980, was a French existentialist philosopher. He was not a Marxist, but was hugely influenced by Marx and other Marxists, especially the Maoist movement in France. Hegel and Marx both agreed that humans are not only the product of history, we humans also serve the purpose of history. Hegel explained reality through a godlike spirit or idea, and Marx explained through historical materialism and class struggle. In other words, both argued that we individuals are there to serve the grander mission or purpose, be it God or history or class struggle or general society. But what's the purpose of an individual human life? Sartre's existentialist philosophy argued that human life has no purpose because we are made neither by God nor by a blind force of history as Marx and Hegel outlined. Instead, we are made by our own history, choices we make in our own life. In other words, we have no essence or purpose from birth. We simply acquire it through our life, often through our own free choices and actions. Since we have no preordained purpose set for us by some other power like God or society, we are free to make mistakes to find our own purpose. Sartre even goes further by saying that we are condemned to be free and condemned to make mistakes. But this freedom comes with, you guessed it, as Uncle Ben said, it comes with responsibility. In other words, we are our own makers. We craft our own self-identity. Therefore, we have to live with what we make of ourselves. Unlike Hegel and Marx, Sartre liberates individuals from the constraints of God, history, traditions, class, and even human nature. So today, a new trend among Homo sapiens is transgenderism, the idea that you can define your own gender identity based on your own feelings. People feel they are in the wrong body and they change their gender in an attempt to correct the incorrect. This might have been difficult in a pre-existentialist era, but now it's widely accepted in most of the developed world. You can decide what your identity is. Instead of your biology, society's history, tradition, or norms defining you, you have the full control to make yourself and find your own life's purpose. As I said, with this freedom comes responsibility. If you make mistakes, you have to own those mistakes. Don't blame others. In other words, if you build a bridge and it collapses, you are responsible. In the same way, you build your own identity. If something goes wrong, you cannot blame others for it. So Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialist philosophy gave the individual the full autonomy to make something of themselves. For him, it wasn't social history, but your own individual history that makes you your own free choices. Slavoj Zizek was born in Slovenia in 1949. Today, he is the most important figure who subscribes to a history-based philosophy. He identifies himself as Hegelian, who argues that Marxism has failed miserably because most Marxists today live in the past, too attached to history. Today's Marxists blame history for their failure. In other words, he says that Marxists today have lost touch with reality and live in the past like an old man who has failed in his life projects. This failure is most visible in his own style, as he uses comedy to cope with that failure. His philosophy is based on philosophical irony. Marxists believe in history and historical struggle. The very history that these philosophers based their ideas failed their attempt to create a truly socialist society. So history failed the philosophical tradition that based its core philosophy on history. Now that's ironic, and so on and so on and so on. You get the point. So to sum up, Hegel said we are the product of history that keeps progressing, and Marx said let's not study history, but let's speed it up to get our final destination, a communist utopia. Sartre argues, forget about class history, we are the product of our own individual history, in which we'll also find our purpose. And finally, Zizek says history has failed us all. We have not progressed but regressed, so our history is nothing but a history of failed intelligence or rationality. Next, I'll discuss the other strand of philosophy that came out of Kant through Schopenhauer, Kierkegaard, and Nietzsche, which emphasizes not rationality or history or society, but passion or will or human psyche, the mysterious subconscious world of psychological philosophy.